All right, we'll go ahead and get started on chapter 8 here. I will give a little bit of a background of what's going on. This is probably my favorite chapter because I've taught journalism 101 and 201 for several years, and I've taught on all the campuses. So what's going on with journalism? That's a really good question today. And again, the title is The Rise and Decline of Modern Journalism. As we know, it is in a state of decline, there's no question. So the point is, even though people still read news from newspapers more than any other time in US history, however, most of the news they get is delivered through Google and Facebook. So they're actually getting links from newspapers. And again, this really made a big shift in terms of how journalism and how newspapers actually made money. So newspapers really have lost their near monopoly on classified advertising. It's shifted to the free sites such as Craigslist and eBay. And again, when I was growing up, the classified ads would take up a big part of Cincinnati Enquirer and the Hamilton Journal, even the New York Times when I lived in Rochester, New York, the same thing. They're hoping that this is trend of less and less reporters and more online in some ways is not going to change. But this Report for America project, they're trying to add 1,000 reporters to daily journalism in the early 2020s, but I don't know if that's going to really happen or not. So in 2001, we had 56,000 reporters working at daily newspapers. In 2017, TV news reporters outnumbered daily paper reporters 27,000 to 25,000. So you can see it's on the drop more than half in terms of the number of actual employees at newspapers itself. And again, this in some ways has been really sad, at least if you wanted to remain as a print journalist. But again, since the times are changing with technology, we more or less have to move on. So how did it really all get started? Colonial newspapers and the partisan press. Again, this is back in the 1700s. Again, when we did have the printing presses. The first one of note would be the Pennsylvania Gazette, 1729. It was operated by Benjamin Franklin. Again, it was run with subsidies from political parties as well as advertising. And again, most of the papers at that time were partisan politics or they were related to business. So another famous one is the New York Weekly Journal, which again was very partisan. And in 1733, the owner was arrested for seditious libel. And again, this became the jury at that time. Again, we were still a colony at that time. The jury ruled in his favor as long as the stories were true. So this really sort of provided the foundation for the First Amendment when you go back to that case in 1733. So again, the types of newspapers were political. Two types, again, partisan press pushed the plan of their particular political group that subsidized the paper. So not dissimilar to what we have going on today with online and TV. And then commercial, which would be serve business leaders, sort of like the Wall Street Journal today, that type of thing. But the readership was primarily confined to educated or wealthy men. And again, it was men at that point. There really was definitely a big divide in terms of no female ownership at that point. So what changed is and again, this is still 1700s, early 1800s, the penny press era, where we had newspapers became a mass media. And this is when we had to the point when the masses could actually read, those that were literate. And it was really made possible technology. So they were sold on the street for a penny. And the idea was that all the immigrants and people who were coming in, as the population exploded in the colonies, again, they wanted some sort of news. So one of the first ones, a lot of these were based in New York City. So we did have some of these papers. Again, there were a lot of competing papers. So the New York Sun would be one of the examples. They would have human interest stories. So they would have news accounts focusing on daily trials and triumphs of the human condition. They featured ordinary individuals with extraordinary challenges. A lot of feature articles. The New York Morning Herald was an independent paper for sort of the middle and working class readers. And again, these became very popular because it was something that sold on the street. You had easy access to it. And again, it made it newspapers did become a mass media at that point. So The penny papers were really kind of innovated. They reported local news and crime. They separated news and the editorial. They tried to be, the goal was to be neutral towards the advertisers, so they didn't just support one. And finally, as we push forward towards 1848, 6 of the New York newspapers combined to create a wire service, which was called the Associated Press. And it was commercial organizations that relayed news stories and information. So it went across telegraph lines across the country and the world, and then they later used radio waves and digital transmissions. But again, a lot of this was around, prior to the Civil War, and a lot of the information that was sent over telegraph, they had to send the most important information first and then the least important second. So that's how we got the inverted pyramid that we use for writing and journalism. So that's another sort of tidbit that goes along with that. The other thing that really happened was sort of the age of the yellow journalism and sensationalism investigation, and this is sort of pushing forward in time a little bit too into the sort of after the Civil War and 1890s, and that yellow journalism was considered papers that carried exciting human interest stories, crime, large headlines. So they were profitable because they did that, but a lot of times they were overly dramatic stories and early in-depth detective stories too. The other thing that they did was investigative journalism, news reports that hunted out and exposed corruption, particularly in business and government. So a lot of these papers competed with each other at that time. And again, everybody knows Pulitzer, who was one of the editors of the New York World. He encouraged plain writing and the inclusion of illustration. So the other thing that happened too is we started to get more imagery in the papers too. William Randolph Hearst was with the New York Journal, was another big player at the time and created an empire. His daughter or granddaughter in the future, I guess it was great granddaughter, was actually kidnapped in the 60s. And the Hearst Castle out in California is really famous because he built this giant, I want to say mansion that still exists out there. And his story was told in Citizen Kane, which was sort of a famous movie in the 30s, or well, placed in the 1930s. And again, it was a pretty cool movie that actually showed his life and tried to dramatize it. So the other thing that we get into is its objectivity in modern journalism, and this is Ox was one of another with the New York Times. So the publisher of the New York Times, even back in the 1800s, the Times sort of became the seminal paper that was really seen as one of the best of the best. You could look at it that way. It tried to distance itself from yellow journalism or sensationalized journalism, tried to focus on documenting major events. It had more affluent readership. But they did lower the price to a penny to attract other readers that were in middle class. So that was the other thing that really happened with the New York Times. The other thing with objective journalism is the idea that it distinguishes factual reports from opinions. So it maintains a neutral attitude towards an issue or event, and it searches out competing points of view among sources. So the idea is that you're just giving the factual information, quotes drive the story, and you don't put or project yourself into the story. And that's one of the things that really is, when you write hard news, that's what we look for. Although people like storytelling, you have to be very careful on how you write the stories that don't bias it one way or another. And it's very difficult. I was not as fond as writing hard news. I can do it, but I wasn't as happy doing it. So this inverted pyramid style came about during that time frame, which the story form of packaging and presenting objective reporting was the idea that you would answer the famous questions, who, what, where, when, and sometimes the why and how at the top. And a lot of times that's what readers are looking for. The less significant details would always be at the bottom. So again, it's become under more scrutiny, but it's sort of a mantra of journalism. If you've done print journalism, then it's really the idea is to remain objective and to not sway the reader. You present the facts and let them make up their own mind. Interpretive journalism, this was more in the late the 1910s through 1930 in that era. The idea was to explain key issues and events and place them in a broader context. And one of the famous journalists at the time was Walter Lippmann, who ranked the press responsibilities. And again, the idea was you would supply facts for the record, give analysis, and advocate plans. This is sort of embraced by what we have with broadcast TV today, because the analysis part and the plan part is, again, might be considering your own opinion, but the analysis part, depending on how you do it, would be, and this is where we get into a little bit of an issue in terms of how you analyze a particular story and how you would say, this is how we solve it. And again, that's why it's considered interpretive journalism, because you're trying to give answers, whereas the other in objectivity, you're just presenting the facts. So the one that I really like is literary journalism. I've always enjoyed this. This is like City Beat. It would be one of the other ones. Rolling Stone was always like this as far as I was concerned. But it's fictional storytelling techniques applied to non-fictional material. It was also called new journalism. Some people thought it was an attack on journalistic objectivity. The responses really included advocacy journalism that promote the cause or a viewpoint, or precision journalism that focused on scientific accuracy, which we need more of today. There's no question, because I think the scientific thing is one of the things that you can't consider opinion if it's objective in terms of proven facts, and that's an issue that we're still fighting today. So the contemporary journalism in the TV and internet age, one of the ones that came out that was big when I was at Miami in 1990 was USA Today. We used that sort of a template in terms of all the what we were studying about journalism. The idea was that it went away from traditional black and white newspapers that were sort of clunky, and the stories would jump from this page to that page. So you would have to read 5 paragraphs and it would jump to page 9. USA Today made a standard that they never jumped any stories. If you started to read the story was right there. So again, it used color, designed vending boxes to look like TVs. They mimicked the broadcast news in the use of brief news items. It became very popular at airports. They did somewhat compete with local newspapers with the idea that it was a national newspaper. So wherever you went, you could pick one up. And again, it did sort of redefine, the direction of the news. And again, most of the papers tried to go to full color at that point after USA came out. And again, this was sort of mid 80s, early 90s kind of time range. So the online journalism that's happened now has really replaced the morning newspaper. There's no question that we look at Facebook or we look at Twitter or we look at different sources to actually get our news. And that also speeds up the news cycle to hyperspeed, which in some ways is bad, because then bad information gets out there quickly, and people always see the initial story. They don't see the retraction or things like that, or something that comes the next day. So that's one of the bad things about it in terms of being so fast. But again, non-traditional sources shape stories. I think this really changed when the Virginia Tech shooting happened, and a lot of the information was coming off Facebook from the students that were actually during the time that it was going on. And I think that was really the big cultural shift as far as I was concerned, that when we started to see Facebook and those become an actual source as opposed to just a social media. So one of the other important things is the consensus versus conflict issue in terms of how newspapers play different roles. And if you have small papers for your hometown, Hamilton, again, we've had a paper for years and years, and finally they did end up packaging it with the Dayton Daily News owns Cox, owns all the papers around here, or most of them. And they end up, then we don't get as much of this consensus-oriented journalism, which is the stories on local schools, events, town government, property crimes, and zoning issues. Usually they were smaller non-daily newspapers, fronted community calendars, meeting notices, careful not to offend the local advertisers. I wrote for one of these, a little community newspaper, for about 2.5, 3 years, where I wrote about political stuff in Butler County, basically council meetings and the commissioners, county commissioners. Conflict-oriented journalism is front-page news defined as events, issues, or experiences that deviate from the social norms. So this is one of the problems is this is the national and metro dailies, and the idea is they want to get something that's not seen as not necessarily negative, but it would be something that gives them more exposure in terms of the stories that they're gathering. So the idea is the journalists, they're supposed to act as neutral fact gatherers and observers and monitoring city institutions and problems. For example, watching Cincinnati's city council and going through that type of thing. But the idea is that, again, sometimes they'll get sensational stories, which when you talk about the ones that deviate from the social norm, because they want the readership. So that's the other issue that is involved in this. So the other thing that they used to do in terms of this, again, scooting back to the Civil War era, that African-American newspapers did actually exist. They faced high illiteracy rates and hostility from white society during the Civil War era. However, I mean, obviously they didn't, it was not, it was popular within the Black community, but it was not popular within society. And again, the decline of these papers, they did last into the 30s and 40s, early 50s. And basically because of TV and black radio stations, they lost advertisers, and then economic declines that's happened in terms of recessions up and down that we've had that reduced the ad budgets. And also in the 70s, the mainstream, after the Civil Rights Act, and papers tried to present themselves in a different viewpoint. So they would have black writers, and this really came about that they would raid those papers to integrate their newsroom. So that was the other thing that really happened in sort of mid 60s, early 70s. Spanish language newspapers did exist. And again, it was really ignored until late 60s. And again, the mainstream papers, they had supplements in Spanish, but many of those that did not work out. Again, now with television and online, we've got all sorts of arenas where they can, if you want to get Spanish news on cable, you can do it. So a lot of the stuff that really went along with the newspapers, you know, I'm sure in some of the states where there are high Hispanic populations, like probably Miami and those, there are still Spanish language newspapers that exist and are probably published daily or weekly. The Asian American newspapers also, again, when you think of West Coast on a lot of this and some on the East Coast, really not so much in the middle of the country, although maybe Atlanta, you know, San Francisco, LA, New York City would have these, and it sort of helped the readers adjust to their foreign surroundings and retain ties to their heritage. But again, these have faced the same problems that the other newspapers have in terms of readership, circulation, how to make money in terms of doing it. The Native American newspapers began with the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828, and it educated tribes about their heritage and built community solidarity. Again, same thing, they sort of went up and down in terms of, you know, the population, and again, advertising went hand in hand with it. I'm sure now everything is probably online, a lot of the reservations, and it's probably, I'm sure it still exists in a form, but it's not the same form that it did in terms of newspapers. The other thing would be the underground press, which was, again, I liked it when I went out to California in the 70s on a trip, and I got to see Haight-Ashbury and all the, in Berkeley out there, where they had a lot of the sort of underground newspapers, which I thought were cool. And usually it would question mainstream political policies. Back in my day, it was the Vietnam War and conventional values. A lot of it was going on about the gay issues, rights issues back then. So it really did document the tension between students, women, minorities, and gay men and women. It really wasn't sort of, and I read some of those. They were kind of cool back then. So how do newspapers really put together a newspaper would be a good way to put it in terms of news operations. So the news hole is the space not taken up by the ads in the newspaper. It usually makes up 35 to 50% of the paper. When I was growing up, the advertising was huge, and a lot of the papers, the Inquirer, the New York Times, all those had pages upon pages of ads. And a lot of that stuff shrank along with the internet and the web presence of a lot of these newspapers too. So it really did shrink by 2010. And again, the news staffs also did change, although there was always, you know, publisher and owner, editors and assistant editors and reporters. But again, the ability for them to make enough money to afford to have a bigger staff has definitely changed. And it wasn't just incrementally. I mean, it's sort of a big boom once internet more or less and social media took over in that sense. So the other thing that we have would be that they could put in a paper would be the wire services, which have syndication. Everybody's probably read a syndicated column, and it would supplement local coverage. And this is something I would have loved to have done, is the feature syndicates, where they have, you know, commercial outlets that contract with newspapers to provide work. So you would have political writers, editorial cartoonists, comic strip artists, self-help columns. I loved the editorial cartoonists and some of the cartoons that would be political. Those were always fun. That's been going on since the 1800s in terms of having political cartoons. It's not probably as big as it used to be in the 60s and 70s, but you still do see some of it, and it pops up on the internet sometimes. And political writers have shifted to some of these blogs. When you think of Slate and think of Mother Jones and a lot of that, those type of websites that really shifted to be pretty much political. So a lot of the things that used to be in newspapers shifted to online in terms of even the political writers that are famous today. So the other thing is the newspaper chains sort of lost their grip. And again, company that owns several newspapers throughout the country, Gwinnett, Cox, you can think a lot of the big players. And again, they really have changed in terms of numbers and shrunk. And these chains really reflected the movement towards oligopolies in the 20s. However, today it's declined because we have fewer readers, less ad revenue. consolidating papers, eliminating jobs. They would sell off the papers. A lot of big cities would have 2 newspapers, and now they're down to the point that they would only have one, a morning or an evening, depending, and most cities would be a morning. So to try to control this and to help the papers remain solvent, the Newspaper Preservation Act came along, and the idea was you'd have joint operating agreements, so 2 competing papers would keep separate news divisions, but merge business and production operations for a period of years. 28 cities adopted the JOAs. I think in Cincinnati, it was the Kentucky Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer, because there was evening and morning, and they, I think they had an agreement at one point, and then the Kentucky Post went under, or it's just a web presence at this point. So by 2003, 16 had been terminated. By 2016, only 5 remained in place in the nation. They were seen sort of as a monopoly, but sometimes that's pretty much the only way to maintain the competition between newspapers. So it really has dropped. There's no question. And it's not that you can't have a job in media or have a job in journalism, but it's just the limitations now of newspapers as opposed to the social media is crazy in terms of trying to compete between the two. So the readership did decline in the United States. And again, this really began with the Great Depression, with the rise of radio. It also dropped in the 60s and 70s when we have TV and these weekly newspapers too. And again, then it dropped in the 2000s when the online readership increased. So, however, other nations and developing nations have experienced increases in readership where they may or may not have internet access or have as many choices on the internet. So that's another issue that you can go back and forth. Is it's still viable, but the question is how much longer is it going to remain viable? So the other thing that really happens are how we have local papers, how small newspapers, local papers, and campus papers retain readers. I think the Miami Student has always had somewhat of a decent base. I think in the past have tried to do something, an online presence too, but traditionally they always did publish in Oxford. I think it was Tuesdays and Thursdays or whatever. I forget 2 days that they would publish, 2 days a week. Some of the bigger universities like IU, they have very big, the Indiana Daily is one that actually is printed every day. And they are pretty cool in terms of for local news at that point. So they're really trusted media outlets in the areas that don't have many radio TV options. So if you didn't have anything beside that paper, the reader's gonna be pretty loyal. And again, they would practice consensus-oriented journalism. So it's basically information, local news. They're not getting into the big national topics. Again, it doesn't result in ad revenue dips when editors tackle a controversial topic. But again, they don't really put as much stuff in those as they would in terms of a bigger newspaper. The other term is media desert, places where it's difficult to access daily local news information. You live in the middle of Montana, you're probably going to have a small town that has one newspaper, and that's pretty much where you get your information aside from TV or online. So the blogs also sort of challenged newspapers' authority online, because most of the newspapers did try to shift to an online presence, but again, they created paywalls, and a lot of people did not want to pay the paywalls. Even the Washington Post, New York Times, it's constantly popping up, getting you to pay, so they increase their revenue. But the sad thing is a lot of people just don't feel like they want to pay for news, is the bottom line. But the blogs in the 1990s, they were sort of dismissed as amateur journalism, so they didn't really have as much credibility. And again, the readership did eventually increase. And again, traditional journalism and their techniques have sort of entered the realm of blogging. So if you have people who've been journalists before, they actually know how to write, and you don't have just somebody spewing out sort of a stream of consciousness, is what I always thought a lot of the blogs were. But it has become a viable main feature, there's no question. So again, this convergence that's happening with the move to digital newspapers really take advantage of the internet's flexibility. They know it has unlimited space, immediate updates, links to related materials, and the multimedia capabilities. The idea also, if you're a journalist in these days, you have to be able to do photography, you have to have interviewing techniques, all this stuff that before was separated. So you have a photographer separated and a journalist at a scene. Now you do it all. But the advances they haven't paid off. Again, the paywall system, charging a fee online to get news content. Most customers are used to getting free stuff, and they just don't want to do it. It's that simple. So here's a little example from the 40s on up to 2018 in terms of circulation, and you can get an idea on how quickly it's sort of gone since the 90s, topping out in the 80s and 90s, and circulation has just kept dropping as we go along. And again, along with circulation, advertising has also dropped too. So that's why the newspapers aren't as solvent as they used to be. And again, many have closed. So what do we do to change it is a good question. And then the new models for journalism, again, try to develop new ventures. Again, they try to get support from universities and our internet companies. Oxford and Miami, we've done a couple different things where we partnered up in terms of a local news and a web presence and a radio presence. We've had that also in Oxford. It was part of the communication program. And the other problem with that is that a lot of the, again, these attempts to do that, unless it's really become popular, it's pretty tough. We did have an NPR radio station in Oxford, MUB, and a television station for years. And both of those have been more or less taken over by the Dayton station in terms of we produce nothing ourselves anymore from WMUB as far as I know. And we used to have a lot of programs that emanated from there. So the public radio and TV are focusing on local news. And again, the universities are trying to become a source of news reporting. But again, the jury's still on that one. And then this National Fund for Local News is trying to help develop new ideas too. So what's another alternative voice would be citizen journalism, where activist amateurs, they use the internet and blogs to disseminate news and information. It's known as citizen media community journalism. So many of the news organizations are trying to corral people to write for them essentially for free to make up for the journalists lost to downsizing. And again, that's an issue in itself too, because are they really trained to write is the other question that goes with that. So here's the sort of the essay type question. When you hook newspapers and democracy together, is it really vital? There's no question about that, but it's a dangerous profession. So if you go overseas or even here, again, almost 1,189 reporters were killed in the line of duty from 92 to 2016. The newsroom cutbacks are also threatening many reporters. And again, with the digital culture growing, what's going to become a newspaper? And that's the $64,000 question. In your lifetime, I don't know what it's going to be like in 10 years. I'm not even sure what it's going to be like in 5 years. But it will definitely definitely involve and could devolve into less and less and less in terms of traditional papers. The only thing that I think about is just like the issue with textbooks. I still think people like the idea of a feel of a newspaper or actually looking at it rather than online, as opposed to like when you get a textbook and it's PDF versus you're actually opening the textbook. It's the same issue back and forth there. Is will we ever give up that tactile feel of, oh my God, I want to hold up my hands and read it? And that could be an argument too that you could make, that is this going to change? And I think it will, there's no question. So well, it kind of wraps up chapter 8.